Rick is one of the very first people I met at Denver Seminary when I moved here 19 years ago, so it's hard to believe, but went to dinner with Rick and his wife Jean because Rick and Alain Dallaire both teach in Old Testament. And so, of course, Alain and I moved here within a month of each other, and then we had dinner with Rick and Jean. Rick has been at Denver Seminary teaching Old Testament for 28 years, 29 years, somewhere in there. And in addition to the teaching that he does there, I mean, he's revered around the world as a premier Old Testament scholar. He wouldn't say that, but I will, and others do. The commentaries and books he's written have had a profound impact on scholarship and Old Testament scholarship around the world, as well as his teaching. Rick and Jean have a house church that they also lead that meets on Saturday evenings. And a fun kind of fact is in Rick's journey toward ordination, St. James got to have a part in that in terms of some requirements for pastoral care. And so Rick made some pastoral visits to people here at St. James in his journey toward ordination, with his primary ministry being teaching. And so it's great not only to have Rick because of his intellect, his heart for Jesus and the local church. His wife is also a Presbyterian pastor. But just his friendship. And so, Rick, welcome. It's great to have you here on this important topic.
Thanks so much, Wayne. And it's wonderful to be here, to be back again, and wonderful to see you all. Thank you for coming. Feel free to move forward if you can't hear or want to see better. These are the two screens, so it's what we can see. Let's pray. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you, Lord, for the blessings you give us in so many ways. And Lord, just give us a heart of gratitude for that. Father, we know that this is one of those questions that remains a challenge and for some really a stumbling block in the journey to faith. And we pray, Father, that today, as we look at so many different aspects of it, you may open our hearts, open our minds, that together we may walk and better understand a little bit about the world of particularly Joshua, particularly the Old Testament, and who you are and how you reveal yourself in these ways. Bless us, Lord, and we thank you. Thank you for all that you've given us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so normally what I do is, this is kind of a lecture presentation, and it focuses in on Joshua in particular, because I tend to do this with one topic rather than do universal kind of general ideas. We usually start with this, so this is Richard Dawkins, one of the neo-atheists, and from his book, The God Delusion. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. So we'll try not to use any of those words again with that many syllables, but you get the impression. And of course, this is one of those more famous quotes that often is used, but it reflects a more broadly based view, which in many ways is still the great issue of our age, and that is how can the God of the Old Testament be God for me? He doesn't seem to be a loving God, and he seems to be a real nasty God. So I want to look at this, and as I say, in particular, often where people go is in the book of Joshua. It's the most famous, with the destruction of the Canaanites and everything. We'll look at one or two other spots along the way, but we'll do it, how can I say that, do it my way, which is a little bit different. It will be less philosophical and more looking at what was the world like and what can we know about it. So it may hopefully broaden out a little bit of our knowledge of the book and story of Joshua and some of the background to that. And so we'll look at Jericho, my idea of it being a fort and recent challenges to that, look at a bit of the archaeology there, look at, and then very briefly at Joshua 10 and 11 and conclusion. And I'm happy to take questions at the end. It just all depends on how long you want to stay. But anyway, we go back all the way to Genesis, and you remember the flood in Genesis that comes, there's sin, and we read in Genesis 6 that the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And the flood becomes an issue as well. There are a number of issues about God being a nasty person in the Bible, but the flood is one of them. How could he destroy all these people? But when we look at the text in terms of the background to that, you see it helps us to understand a little what's going on. The earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. And out of this then God sends the flood. But notice what's being described here. Every thought was violent with murder and destruction. And there is this sense that humanity at this point had so degenerated to become bent on destroying itself and all life. So in a very perhaps odd way, I don't know if you thought about this, but sending the flood enabled God to preserve one nonviolent family, the family of Noah, and thus to preserve the human race rather than to have it kind of self-destruct, as was happening. And certainly Noah would not have survived that, given the description that we have there in Genesis 6. But God wished for humanity to survive and therefore went in this direction. In fact, in a real sense, God rejects violence in humanity from the beginning. And for Noah and his family, he makes a covenant with them when they come off the ark, and it applies to all generations after that, all humanity. And Genesis 9:6 is at the heart of that, where it says, whoever sheds human blood, by human shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. We could spend a lot of time looking at this idea of the image of God, but clearly the sense here and what is constant in the Old Testament is that the value of human life supersedes everything else in the world, in material possessions. No amount of gold is worth a human life. There is something much more profound and of value. It is transcendent because it is made, we are made in God's image, each of us. So then we look as we sort of zoom along through the rest of the first 5 books of the Bible, looking towards Joshua. I want to say one or two things. There's the famous Genesis 15 where God says to Abram, from whom will come Israel. He speaks about them going into Egypt and then says, in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites or Canaanites or all these people in Canaan has not yet reached its full measure. So there's some sense of sin and wrongdoing there. But as we'll see as we move forward with Joshua, that's not emphasized. It's a question of belief and faith. It's a question of where do they stand in relationship to God. Now, I want to sort of stop on the way and visit with Joseph. Joseph, you'll remember, was the son of Israel, or Jacob, and a favored son of him, but the brothers were all jealous, and they got together, and when he was out of the purview of his father, they captured him and sold him into slavery in Egypt, and then through a gradual set of stories and events, he rises there by God's grace to become second in command, only second to the king or Pharaoh of Egypt. And then part of what he's doing there is collecting grain over 7 years of plenty, because he had interpreted the dream of Pharaoh so that that would be followed by 7 years of famine. And in those 7 years, people would need food. And that's what happened. And so we drop in on Joseph in chapter 47. There was no food, however, in the whole region because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. The point is, he had food, and that food he made available to the people of Egypt and Canaan. And this is important. There's a sort of map, and you can see, I don't know if that'll come through. Yeah, it does. So that's, of course, Egypt, and over here is Canaan, right sort of next door to Egypt. Like today, you have Egypt, and you have Israel, Palestine, Gaza, that whole area. But what I want you to understand is from that verse, this description suggests that if it had not been for God working through Joseph, Egypt and Canaan would have starved. There would have been nobody. Now, some people might have gone to other lands to try to find food, but there would have been no life. And so it is through Joseph's work and the work of this son of Israel that he gives them life. That God gives life to that generation, and by implication to all generations after that. And that's important. In fact, Joseph says this very much at the end of Genesis, when the brothers come back. Their father has died. They're concerned now, will Joseph take revenge against us? And Joseph says to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. One of the, oftentimes when we read that in context, and I think rightly so, the first thing we think of is the saving of the lives of the offspring of Jacob, of his family, which would become Israel. But he doesn't qualify it. And in many ways, what he saved was the lives of Egypt and the lives of Canaan. So it's all the more dramatic in the following chapter when it says there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph or what he had done. In other words, they didn't pay any attention. They forgot. They dismissed it. And so how did they repay? How did the Egyptians repay? Well, by enslaving Israel and by then trying to destroy them and kill all the children. And that's what we'll see happens in Canaan too. And so God protects them and they survive, but it reverses this idea a little bit, and this, to anticipate where we're going, in terms of it's not so much Israel conquering Canaan as much Israel defending itself against those who would destroy it. When we come to the law, perhaps the key text on Joshua and genocide and the whole question of that is Deuteronomy 20, which talks about warfare. It first talks about battles with cities and peoples outside of the promised land, outside of Canaan. But then it goes on in chapter 20 at verse 16 to say, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So this is sometimes quoted, as an example of a way in which God has commanded a kind of genocide. And I think you have to understand how the law works here and elsewhere. The law recognizes and reveals a God who is a God of love and a God of holiness. And these two things are essential to the characteristic of the God of the Bible and the Christian God. God is in essence love, and that's a very important part of what it means for him to be Trinity, 3 in 1, because it means he is love from the beginning. He didn't have to create to show love, although he did, and thank God for that. But he is love and he is holiness. He is other. He creates humanity out of love. But the sinfulness of humanity involves taking what God has created and using it for our own purposes. We do this every time we sin. And so, in one sense, we all deserve death. And there is that theological reality. The wages of sin is death, as Romans says. But then the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ. But this is the point of the text, to teach this. This is part of a legal text. Legal texts often reflect an idealized structure of how the people of God should live, emphasizing God's holiness and the need for separation so that we're not being led into any other direction. But what actually happened is the question. What happened, as you might say, on the ground? Most people do not object to God's love and goodness because of a law, because laws go in different directions. They object because they perceive the Bible to describe actual destruction of innocence, mandated by a cruel God. And the only way I can answer this, well, the best way anyway for me, is on a case-by-case basis. And that's why we'll now look at Joshua and the wars of Joshua. The ideal of Deuteronomy is to teach about God's holiness. And this is true of much of ancient Near Eastern law. There are idealistic laws set up. It's not a description necessarily of what actually happens. In fact, what happens may be somewhat different. For Israel's understanding of what happened, we turn to Joshua 1 to 11, and the beginning of the story with Jericho. This is standing on Jericho many years ago now, not quite at the time of Joshua, but it's quite a few decades now since I lived in Israel and had the opportunity to visit different parts of this for a bit of time. Yeah, this is the side of Jericho looking eastward towards what is today Jordan and the valley that goes in between and some of modern Jericho. So, to anticipate what I'm going to say, I think Jericho was a fort. Now, what does that mean and how does that work? Cities existed. They sure did in the ancient world. They weren't as big as they are now, but they still existed. They represented the military and the leadership. They also represented oppression and rulership. That was the cities of Canaan. So in Deuteronomy 20 is a command to destroy those cities. It uses the term cities there. Destruction of armies, their forts, and the oppressive religion and ideology, because the cities tended to be where the temples were and the worship of other gods and goddesses. That's where you went. Those things that opposed Israel as a people and opposed their God, and destroying this ideology of force. Now, the word for city in Hebrew, Deuteronomy 20, Jericho, Ai, and others are called cities. The word for city is just like the thing on the side of your head in terms of pronunciation. It's ear. That's how you pronounce the word, ear. And it's used very often in the Old Testament, and it's used for a variety of things. It's used for any population center. It's used 13 times in Joshua at the destruction of Jericho. It's called a city, an ear. The little town of Adam, as it's called, north on the Jordan Valley at the river, a bit to the north where the Jordan River is stopped when Israel walks across the Jordan dry land. That's called a city. The village of Bethlehem in 1 Samuel is called an ear. Even tent encampments, which aren't necessarily permanent, but are there, but it's where you have a population, is called an ear. The citadel at Rabbah, the capital of the Ammonites, modern-day Ammon, sort of within the city of Rabbah, is called also an ear. And the fort of Zion, as well in Jerusalem, is called, an ear. There we go. the Bible commands here in Deuteronomy destruction of these, and it's specifically the cities. The cities contained the royal stores, the temples, the barracks. The masses, most of your average person, lived in hamlets around it, and they would come into the city for market purposes, or if they were attacked and the army was there, that would be a place to defend. So if we look at Shechem is a great example of this. Here you see the wall in the foreground, and the background is the Palestinian city of Nablus. But in the foreground, you see some of the remnants of this fortification, and it's a pretty strong wall that was built actually a few hundred years before Israel shows up. This is the temple, the remains of the temple with the standing stone there. It's actually very likely the same one mentioned in Judges 9 with Abimelech. And if you read that, that's it. Only has a tower, of course, in its time built on top of it. But yeah, that was the temple to the foreign god. These are some of the remnants of the gates, large structures that would guard and form some of the wall. But you see, it's a massive center, and this is just one example of what we have here. It is, in fact, a city, but it's also a place where the army would be, and primarily that. So what about Jericho? What was Jericho when we come back to it? And yeah, it's been excavated for more than 100 years by English archaeologists, Garstang and Kenyon, and more recently by an Italian-Palestinian team a few years ago. During the time that we're interested in, which was the time when Israel comes into the land, which is either in the 14th century or in the, as I would take, either in the 15th century or in the 13th century, there really isn't any evidence of occupation. It's one of the big question marks about Jericho and what's happening. There is in between, there is a little bit of a text, some pottery, and a building that has been found at this site, but not a lot. The Italian excavator Lorenzo Nigro argued that there is occupation, but no pottery evidence for anything during the time we're interested in between, whether you take an early date or a late date for the Exodus. There's no evidence during Joshua is what it comes down to. So what's going on? Well, one of the things about this is that you might, if you're looking for evidence, when you date something like this, you date it on the basis of certain types of pottery. It's like today, we use china or any goods. They change in style over time, and you can work that out, and then you look at the pottery on the basis of the style of the pottery, you can determine when it was used and when that was occupied, that area. And this is one of the things. But your basic, very simplest pottery doesn't change so much in style. It pretty much remains the same. And that seems to be what we have here during the time of Joshua. We don't have this change. What does that mean? Well, it means it wasn't a place where people lived who were wealthier and could afford things. It, however, could be a place where there was a garrison and a fort. Jericho itself is only a few acres. It's not very large, contrary to what you see in all the movies, even Joshua and the big wall. You see this huge. It's not. Look, they could march around. Well, I'll get to that in 7 times in a day. Joshua 2, the king hears and responds quickly, which is consistent with a small site when they hears about the spies in. They didn't have to go, take a bus to get across the area. It was small enough, as I said, to march around 7 times in one day and fight a battle, as Joshua does in chapter 6. And this is true of the site everybody recognizes as Jericho, which is Tel Es Sultan. It's just a couple of acres. It's not huge. It is there, however, and very clearly was occupied for thousands of years, though we don't have evidence the times we're interested in. It, interesting, does lie at the end of several main roads that go into the central hill country. The south road goes to Jerusalem and is made famous in New Testament times by the story of the Good Samaritan, who is on that road. The central road, one goes to Bethel and one goes farther north. It is an ideal place if there wasn't an independent city there to have a fort there. And that is what I think it was at this time. It was a fort. It was garrisoned by cities like Jerusalem and elsewhere. There's no note on a large size. It's never called big. Gibeon is called a great city in Joshua 10. Hatzor is called the head of all the kingdoms of the north in Joshua 11. But Jericho is never called anything like that. So, if that's the case, what is Rahab doing there, and what is she? Is she the only non-combatant? Well, there are two texts in Joshua, and in the whole Bible actually, that describe the destruction of Jericho and then of Ai. In chapter 6 we read, when they take Jericho, it says they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword everything in it, every living thing, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and it sounds like genocide against everybody who was there, a regular city. Something a bit similar in 825 concerning Ai, which is next on the list. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. So that's like the New International Version, but the Hebrew phrase isn't quite men and women or young and old. It actually, Meishva Ad Isha is the Hebrew, and it means from man to woman. It's a little bit odd. You can say men and women in Hebrew just as you can in English, but what is from man to women? Well, it only occurs 7 times in the Bible, once in Jericho, once with regards to Ai, and then Amalek, which is destroyed by Saul, and then the prophet Samuel has 1 or 2 things to say about that in 1 Samuel 15. Nob, where Saul destroys the inhabitants. Jerusalem, where it's not a war, that's just when David brings the ark in and everybody celebrates from man to woman. Same way, Nehemiah 8 is kind of a big gathering in Israel, as is 2 Chronicles of all Israel, from man to woman. It's a way of saying all or everyone. It's simply a way, it's what I would call a stereotypical way for everyone in a town or region without assuming anything more about age or gender. And that is what I think is being said here. In other words, it doesn't say that women were killed. It doesn't say non-combatants were killed. If it was a fort, then it was in fact a military installation, and it was the military force that was killed there. It's not that they had to go out and find non-combatants and bring them in and kill them or something like that, which would be ridiculous, but rather there's simply a general way of saying everyone without assuming anything about age or gender. And in this case, I think it was warriors. Rahab was the exception. Let me explain. Rahab would have been the innkeeper. Rahab the prostitute would have been the innkeeper along with her family, and that would have been part of what the purpose was there for. In other words, this was a fort to guard major passageways north-south, and as I showed, east-west into the hill country. And they no doubt taxed people, merchants and others who came through, and they gave them a place to stay overnight. And that's where I think Rahab comes in. Now, the second question besides city is the question of what about king? It says a king was there, so doesn't that mean a king ruled over a city with all kinds of people? It's used 3 times in chapters 2 and 6 of Jericho. He had a king, and 5 times more of the king of Jericho later on. The traditional meaning of a king then would be that Jericho was a royal castle or fort or palace or something. But the region is otherwise pretty much uninhabited at this time. At least there's nothing mentioned of other people there between Adam up north a bit and the Dead Sea. So what's going on? And this is where I bring in a little bit more of some work I've done. A group of letters, in fact, the largest collection of written evidence outside of the Bible from before Alexander the Great, really, is this group of letters called the Amarna correspondence from a site in Egypt called Amarna. And these are over 300 letters written by Canaanite princes to the Pharaoh of Egypt. See, at this time, the whole area of Canaan was part of what's called the New Kingdom Empire. out of Egypt. So Egypt controlled this area, at least in name only, sometimes they marched their armies in there, sometimes not as much. But whatever the case, you've got letters from all over where the local princes of these different Canaanite cities, like Jerusalem, not yet in Israelite hands, but it would be one of them, and we have letters from the king of Jerusalem writing, as well as other kings all over the different cities of Canaan. And they write to Pharaoh, they call him king because he is their king, their overlord, to the king, my lord. That's the letters from Jerusalem 6 times. In 6 letters they say this. But interesting, one of the big Canaanite centers was this site of Hatzor to the north in Israel. And he writes to the Pharaoh, he says to the king, my lord, he recognizes him as king, but then he calls himself a king. So this is a king, which, when you think about it, is not that surprising, but he's a sort of a sub-king, a little king, underneath the high king, which in this case, the emperor, which is Pharaoh. And that is sometimes the case of what we have here. So the king of Hatzor is this way, but yet he says, I fall at the feet of Pharaoh, my king, self-humiliation, everything. He recognizes him as his superior. So the idea of a figure like this, Abdi Tirshi was his name in Hatzor, was called a king and yet recognized a greater king over him. So the ruler of Jericho could have been under authority to another, whether the leader of Bethel or Jerusalem or a coalition such as that of Joshua 10. Jericho's king would have been fort commander and would have governed troops and maintained security against enemies and their agents, and collected taxes or fees of people coming through. One other interesting aspect of kings in this collection of letters is a guy named Piwuri, who actually uses the same word it's the same root, Malik in Hebrew, it's Melech in that same text for king. It's the word for king. And he worked around Canaan. He was actually a commissioner for the Pharaoh. He moved around to Gaza, Jerusalem, Byblos up north, and ran errands and administered things and saw that everything was going according to what Pharaoh wanted. Now, like Piruri, was Jericho's Melech a commissioner responsible to his overlord for military security in the region? Both would have been answerable to an overlord, whether Pharaoh or the rulers in the hill country. So that's just to say that the word king is not an insuperable barrier to calling Jericho a fort or understanding it that way any more than the word city is. In fact, it fits with the descriptions of that time. What about the size of the army? Of course, this gets into all kinds of questions, and they may come up later on. You may have some questions about Israel and things, but here I just want to talk about the size of Jericho's army. What do we know? Well, no numbers indicate how large the army was in the text. Was it hundreds? Was it thousands? How many did they have to fight? Well, again, we come back to these Amarna texts. Now, again, nothing here tells us how large the armies were, but the city leaders regularly write to the Pharaoh and say, I'm utterly loyal and all my enemies are your enemies, and I need reinforcements. So they're regularly asking for reinforcements. There we do get numbers. So the leader of Jerusalem, seeks 50 troops to defend his city. Similar to the leader of Byblos, Ribadi, also 50 troops. The leader of Tyre, Abimilki, seeks 20 troops as reinforcements to defend his city. Now, Jerusalem, of course, is closest to Jericho. So what about 50? If that's 50 reinforcements, what is the original number? A 5 or 10% increase would be insignificant if there were hundreds and hundreds of people of an army in Jerusalem. But 50 additional troops, if it were 3 times or 4 times, if the army there were 3 times or 4 times that size, it would be a significant increase. And so that's what I'm thinking. Jerusalem maybe had no more than a few hundred troops at this time, and possibly a smaller number. Jericho, being much smaller, would have had fewer as well, especially if it was a fort, may have had 100 troops or less defending it. That's the reality on the ground, and that matches the size of Jericho in terms of what we know, a couple of acres in terms of its size. So then why so much time spent with Jericho in Joshua? Why is it that you've got chapter 2 with Rahab, and then you've got chapter 6? Well, very good question, and a very important one for a variety of reasons. More words are spent on Jericho than on Hatzor, that's 170 acres up north. It's much larger. But Jericho was the first battle Joshua led. In Joshua 1, God makes clear that Joshua was leader and a successor to Moses. But what about the people? And this is part of those opening chapters of Joshua. Were the people convinced? Were they going to recognize in Joshua the legitimate leader and successor to Moses? And in chapter 3, verse 7, this is what God says. Today, as you cross the Jordan River, in this miracle of the river of the waters being parted, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of Israel, so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. You see, what was important about this first battle was that God was with Joshua, and that Joshua was the true, bona fide, legitimate representative. And therefore, all Israel could unite against Joshua and could know that they were following God as they followed Joshua. And this is a very interesting point, because in chapter 6, when we read about the destruction of Jericho, once they march around 7 times, as you know, and then the walls fall down and they enter in. Just that part, not the marching around, but just the destruction. The battle itself has, I've counted the words, and there's 102 Hebrew words there. Intermixed with that is the story of the salvation of Rahab and her family. And there are actually 86 words in the Hebrew devoted to that, which means I don't think the author sat there and counted the words, but I think that what was the concern was that the salvation of Rahab was as important as the destruction of Jericho, because the mercy of God was key here. And this was the great example which, if the rest of the nations would have heard and understood it, I'm sure they heard about it, they too could have followed God, and they too could have found salvation, but they didn't. So, while many who criticize the God of Joshua as genocidal ignore any careful study of all the historical and other stuff and the comparative evidence, and so never bother to address this analysis. It's sort of we all know the Bible says this school of thought. But if you actually look at the evidence, in my understanding of it, this is not a genocidal act against a group of innocents in Jericho. This is the destruction of a fort that was actually set there to thwart the ongoing movement of God as represented by the Ark of the Covenant and his people. And for 7 days, they marched around. And the verb used there is the same verb as in the Psalms, where it says, march around Zion or Jerusalem and consider her defenses and admire them and all that God has given you in this. Because the point of it is, that's what they were doing. They were ceremonially inspecting each day to see if the gate was open, to see if there was an opening other than the window of Rahab that would show that there was a willingness to open up to Israel. But for 7 days, the gates were shut. So, is this a legitimate interpretation? It may not have heard this on, normally. Okay, let's look at Charlie Trim's critique in The Destruction of the Canaanites. Trim wrote a really nice book. It's his credit. A lot of really good work on warfare in the Old Testament. But I want to look at what he says about me, because that's kind of where I come down on with regards to this. and he criticizes me. But it's helpful because it's somebody else rather than just me. One way forward is provided by me, who argues that the killing in the book of Joshua was restricted to military battles apart from civilians, while the accounts of the conquest of Jericho and Ai appear to involve the defeat of a settled city full of civilians. Hess shows how each part of this description could be interpreted in other ways. For example, the word city, and this is a really nice summary, so it's kind of helps as a review. The word city can refer to a fort, while the walls might have been the exterior walls of a circle of houses around the city. The presence of Rahab at Jericho does not necessarily indicate the presence of other civilians. She and her family might have been the only non-combatants in the city running the sort of hotel there. The phrase men and women, young and old, in reference to those killed may simply be stereotypical phrase meaning all, and not a literal reference to civilians and children. The king could refer to a military leader or commissioner. So we're all good up to this point. Now we diverge. The main problem with Hess's argument is that each part of his vision of the conquest is certainly possible, but his argument requires a large number of merely possible interpretations to come together to make it work. In addition, seeing Jericho as a military base could imply a stronger centralized government that had the power and wealth to support it. However, such a powerful government was not known to be present in the hill country during this time. In other words, what he's saying is nobody living in Jerusalem thought they could control something as far away as Jericho. I'll get to that. The Amarna letters portray many small city-states there, not the kind of government that could afford to create and maintain a military outpost at the eastern foot of the highlands. Finally, most military camps throughout history have included civilians and families. Only the most temporary bases, like those directly on the front lines, would have excluded civilians. If Jericho was a military base, it seems likely it would have been a more permanent kind of encampment in which at least some civilians would have lived. Indeed, in a siege situation, the civilians often fled to a fortified area for defense. Hess's argument would work better if the Israelites were fighting the army in the field rather than in a fortified city. I'll try to answer this. First of all, if Jericho was not a fort, what was it? It certainly was not a city of various classes of people. Such a phenomenon would have left diagnostic pottery that you could see, and there it's not there. No such pottery has ever been found at Jericho, either for this time period, the Late Bronze. Either it was uninhabited or a fort occupied mainly by soldiers who would not leave any pottery other than the most common that did not change from generation to generation, as the more elite styles did. If there were other civilians in Rahab's family, why are they not named? Why does the text, which goes into more detail about Jericho than any other city in Canaan in the book of Joshua, why does the text never mention any other civilians, but does identify the king, agents of the king, soldiers of the army? Go through the battles in Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The descriptions are replete with non-military figures involved in all manner of intrigue whenever a population center is concerned. Again, where is the archaeological evidence for a city at Tel Es-Sultan at Jericho populated with civilians? The pottery isn't there. The phrase from man to woman is a unique phrase that appears only 7 times in the Bible, always synonymous to everyone, and never concerned whether that everyone included non-combatants or combatants. There are many examples of other terms to describe the entire population, and then going on to specify who that involved. In every case, from man to woman is stereotypical and identifies everyone without regard to the presence of genders, the combatant nature of those involved. This is important because on this phrase rests the entire argument for the biblically explicit presence of non-combatants, other than Rahab's family, in the fort or city of Jericho and that of Ai. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there were non-combatants there. Now, I wax a little more rhetorical here. It is indefensible to call the above 3 points possible interpretations. Such a weak argument ignores the archaeological reality of Jericho and the unique Hebrew linguistic features of the phrase in point 3, from man to woman. These are not merely possible, they are the only interpretation, taking into account both the biblical and extra-biblical evidence and accepting that something resembling the events of chapters 2 and 6 of Joshua did take place in the last century, that is in the 13th century BC. It is not enough for someone to attack a position by describing it as merely possible. They must present an empirically based rational argument that is more compelling. and I don't believe Trim does in this case. Actually, the Amarna texts provide a geopolitical reality in southern Canaan that fits this interpretation. As has long been noted by Amarna scholars, the Canaanite city-states for the 14th century BC Amarna, it's 100 years before Joshua. These letters were written. For that period, revealed just this sort. Naaman, I mentioned here, who wrote his doctoral thesis in Israel on this very point, the city-states and how they were formed and everything. This is the picture of the southern coalition led by Jerusalem's leader in Joshua 10, 1-5. The presence of a fort in the Jordan Valley at the ancient site of Jericho is exactly what one would expect. Someone would control this region politically and militarily and gain profit from the tariffs charged merchants and other travelers passing through it. As David Dorsey points out, and I talk about the three roads that I already mentioned, you know, the one in the south going to Jerusalem with the Good Samaritan, it would be expected that sites such as Jerusalem, and you see the Amarna letters for all kinds of relationships with the other city-states and leaders much farther north, south, and west than Jericho, that it would be expected that sites such as Jerusalem would have an interest in maintaining garrisons and political control at such a key nearby area. This could have been further garrisoned by nearby allies such as Bethel, if they were allies. Now, one more point about this whole thing. Well, Jericho's too far away from Jerusalem. They couldn't have controlled it. Well, actually, in the Amarna letters, we have alliances and city-state control of regions could be found throughout Canaan. The ruler of Jerusalem complains that the alliance of Gezergath and Keilah have seized Beth Horon, a town of the land of Jerusalem. It sounds like he controlled it or wanted to. Beth Horon is 12 to 14 miles, depending upon upper or lower Beth Horon, northwest of Jerusalem. Jericho is 18 miles east of Jerusalem. It's the same figure, roughly. This isn't that far away. There is no basis for stating that Jerusalem could not maintain a military outpost as far away as Jericho. And I don't know, he says most military bases throughout history have included families. Well, still waiting for the evidence. What I do know is that there is an absence of evidence for such a phenomenon at Jericho. Here, Trim moves to possibilities of his own without presenting evidence. So I say that. I mean, again, I like Trim's book. I just disagree with him here. That's Jericho. I'm not going to spend as much time at Ai, so don't worry. This is the remains of what is probably Ai. The word actually means, and in the book of Joshua, it's always called the Ai, because the word Ai is Canaanite for ruin. It's the ruin. That's what it actually is calling it. And this looks pretty much like a ruin. These are the remains of walls from around 2000 to 2500 BC, 1,000 years before before Joshua. So what they did, these are, and Ai's associated with Bethel, and you can stand there and see where Bethel is. It's a mile or two away to the west. This guarded, just like Jericho guarded passes, this guarded the way up from the Jordan Valley, and it's a pretty steep ascent, since the Jordan Valley at that point around the Dead Sea is the lowest spot in the world. It's a steep ascent up to this area. It guarded the road up there. And what they did was they took the ruins that had been there for 1,000 years and they fashioned a fort out of them. It makes perfect sense given what they were doing. They were trying to guard the routes going up. And we have other examples of forts guarding, like in Jerusalem you go today, the suburbs of Jerusalem have forts like this around them at French Hill and Gilo and so forth. So Joshua 7-8 is as problematic as Jericho in terms of the archaeological evidence. We don't have it at Ai for occupation at that time. But again, I would say that's because they were a fort, they were garrisoned, and the army doesn't use fancy pottery. Similar to Jericho, with a king with walls, with an army, and similar, the king or Melech was a local commander with superiors at Bethel in this case. The walls were mud brick or a makeshift setup from earlier walls. As I say, I means ruin. The non-combatants and combatants are not distinguished. Again, it says from man to woman, the same phrase, stereotypical, and here I think it describes the warriors. So that's I. Same view in my view. And now we come to Joshua 10 and 11. What about this? Because particularly Joshua, well, let's look first at the nature of these battles. In Joshua 10, we have the southern coalition led by the leader, the Canaanite leader of Jerusalem named Adoni-Zedek. King of Jerusalem heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and that the people of Gibeon had made a treaty. As you remember, the Gibeonites joined. They tricked Israel into making a treaty with them, with Israel, and had become their allies. So what does the king of Jerusalem do? He contacts 5 other buddies, or the kings of Jerusalem, 4 other buddies, Hebron, Yarmouth, Lachish, and Eglon, all in the south. They all joined forces. They move up with their troops and took positions against Gibeon. The Gibeonites then send word to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal, don't abandon your servants. We've got a treaty with you. Come and help us. Of course, that's what Israel does. Now, does anyone doubt that had this coalition from the south actually taken and destroyed Gibeon, they would have moved on against Israel because that was their main enemy. And the whole thing with the Gibeonites was to teach them a lesson. In the north, you don't have Gibeon. In the north of Israel, you have Yavin or Jabin, king of Hatzor, that big city to the north of the Sea of Galilee. He heard of this. He sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the kings of Shimron and Akshaph. They came together with their troops and a large army of horses and chariots, a huge army as numerous as the sand on the seashore. All these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. In other words, what I'm getting at with both of these in the south and the north, it wasn't Israel that initiated these battles. It was the southern coalition and then the northern coalition that initiated them. And had Israel not fought back, they would have been wiped out. That seems to me pretty clearly what the implication is here. For Israel, these were defensive wars so that they could survive. The southern and northern coalitions created defensive wars. Either Israel had to fight or it faced extinction. Non-combatants are not specifically mentioned anywhere. And in Joshua 10, 28 to 42, you have this repetitive statement. They went to city X, and they wiped out all the inhabitants, they destroyed it, and then they went to city Y, and they wiped out all the inhabitants, and they destroyed it. Then they went to city Z. They go through the south, through 7 cities, and all but the one in the middle, it says they destroyed it. That's Gezer, they didn't. But all the rest they did. But what were these cities? Well, these cities, where they weren't just like Jericho, but they were like Jerusalem and the others. They were a large fortified center where the king lived in his palace, where the temple was that worshiped the foreign gods, where the army was, or would have been, except they've all left. They went to fight against Israel, and they were wiped out in the process, as you read about in the first half of chapter 10. So this is what a city, well, the remnants of the city of Shechem would have looked like, but it's the same for the... There is no reason to assume that non-combatants were slaughtered. And so I'm getting towards the end here. Paul Copan, it's a well-known book, Is God a Moral Monster? It's a really nice study of the Old Testament God, and this is one of his central things. He quotes me, he says, I've written on this subject, and I argue that the Canaanites targeted for destruction were political leaders and their armies rather than non-combatants. So the non-combatant innocents were not slaughtered. Just think of this for a minute. First of all, you don't live in the city. If you're the average Joe Canaanite, you live outside of the city, okay? You live in a hamlet or something else. You only go in the city for actually, you go in when you have to bring in your tribute, which is grain, and then it's redistributed to you. But if there's a battle or something, but that only makes sense to take advantage of those fortifications if there's an army there. If your army is left and has now been decimated and doesn't exist anymore, somebody you hear through rumors and things that Israel is coming and they're destroying every city, are you going to go and sit in the city and wait until they come? No. You're much more likely, you might run away. There was no command for Israel to run down every Canaanite that ran, especially if they immigrated to another country. In fact, the very verb often that's used of doing this is, for the Israelites, is to dispossess the inhabitants of Canaan. And so that would be possible. I don't know that many would have done that. You could convert and become an Israelite like Rahab did. That was always available, but according to chapter 11 of Joshua, it didn't happen in that first generation. Rahab was about the only one, at least in the initial battles, who converted. And the Gibeonites, of course, had their own deception. So what was left? Well, exactly what Israel does a generation or two later, when the Midianites and the Arameans and the others come in and try to and wreak havoc on their villages and burn down and steal their food. They go and hide in the caves and in the cracks and nooks and crannies of the land. And there are thousands of those. No army can ever go through all of those and try to find everybody. They'll never succeed. So just like the Israelites themselves did against their enemies in the book of Judges, very likely that's what the Canaanites did in this case. They would hide in the hills. And then the Israelites would come through, they would destroy the defenses, and they would go on. None of these cities, Israel did not occupy any of this area. The area that Israel actually occupies is in the hill country, initially. And then it's allotted these other areas, and they gradually move into them. But Israel occupies the hill country where there is virtually nobody there. And that we know archaeologically as well as from the stories and accounts in Judges, Ruth, and Samuel. Anyway, the book of Judges has plenty of Canaanites. There was no extermination of the Canaanites. They hid. So now I'm summarizing here. I'm almost at the end. Neither the biblical text of Joshua nor that of Judges supports any genocide. The attacks on Jericho and Ai were assaults on military targets. The major wars that Israel fought were defensive. Canaanites remained in all regions, as Judges says, and intermarried with Israelites in the following generations. This is the narrative's understanding of the battles. The archaeological and extra-biblical evidence do not contradict it. In the case of Deuteronomy and Joshua, the Israelites attacked forts, the cities. They did so in order to defend their own existence, and in the cases of Jericho and Ai, to challenge the claims of the kings of Canaan that their army and their armies who claimed the land for themselves and their gods. The Israelites fought and defeated the armies of Canaan and their leaders. They did not commit genocide. As the larger context demonstrates, Joseph, the son of Israel, quite literally, rescued the Canaanites and the Egyptians and gave them life centuries before the Canaanites sought to destroy Israel. Far from genocide, the larger narrative forbade murder, and an Israelite delivered the earlier generation of Canaan from famine and death. The descendants of Canaan repaid those to whom they owed their lives by attempting to exterminate them. The shoe was on the other foot. Thank you. That's everything. You can look, read further if you, if you wish. And I have a website at the bottom, which is more general, oldtestamentquestions.com. So, I don't know, questions or any questions, comments? Yes, Eric, thanks. Aaron.
Clarifying your understanding of I. So, I missed something, but you're thinking it was a fort, kind of like Jericho. How many combatants are we talking?
Well, of course, it tells us in the text, doesn't it? It uses a term, I think is it 36,000 or something? 30,000 yeah. 30,000 what?
30,000 men went against it.
Yeah. of the inhabitants of Ai, 12,000, let's say 12,000. Okay, that's really interesting because it sounds that's entirely contradicting everything I said about Jericho on the surface, but it really isn't. The word for 1,000 in Hebrew is the word eleph, like the first half of elephant. Only, it's eleph. And it's used, like it says there were 600,000 plus Israelites who came out of Egypt. That's 600 and eleph and some change. That goes through. The thing about that word is it can also mean not 1,000, but it can mean a military unit, like a squad or something like that. And I think here that's exactly what it means. I don't think there were 12. Oh, sorry, I'll take this out for a minute. I want to bring up something else here. I don't think there were 12,000. I think there were 12 squads or military units. And I don't think even that the number of Israelites coming out of Egypt was 600,000 military warriors, and usually people say, oh, that's about 2 million then total. That's more than the population of Egypt at the time. That's many times more than the population of Canaan at the time. Who would have sent spies in and come back, well, we can't take this. We just can't do it. In fact, it is actually problematic. If you just give me a minute here. I gotta spell firstborn right, B-O-R-N. Okay, run through this. Okay, there we are. I'll make it a little bit larger because they use this term, okay? So in Numbers 3:42, it says, can you read it there? There we are. Moses counted all the firstborn of the Israelites. The total number of firstborn males a month old or more listed by name was 22,000 plus. Do the math. Take 600,000 warriors and divide it by 22,000. That means every mother in Israel had an average of 25 males. Now that just doesn't make, I'm not saying God couldn't do it. I'm not saying God couldn't bring a couple million people through. But I'm saying if you have a legitimate way of understanding this, why not use that? Why not say what this is talking about? And it's most often in military context. The word doesn't mean 1,000 as in 999 plus 1. It means a squad or a unit. And that, I think, is a much more reasonable way to interpret it, in the same way at Ai. So I would say at Ai, it's 12 squads, 120 to 200, 100 to 200 people, a military army there. And I think that's the same with Israel. Israel coming through is maybe the total number 10 to 20,000, something like that. That makes a lot more sense for the time, and it works with the numbers. The numbers are always difficult. And here they become really weird if you start doing that. So that's my take on that. It gets off into a little bit of a tangent, but you understand what I'm doing. Yeah, thank you for asking. Yes, you are? Joe.
The objection I've heard is when the beginning of the end of Saul, for not leaving anything alive on God's command.
Well, yeah, that's another story. That's the story of the Amalekites and the killing of the Amalekites, and you should kill them all, and that's it. And that's, I didn't touch on that, but that's a whole different sort of discussion. But it's an important one, because obviously there it does seem to be, it's not just Saul's disobeying, he's actually supposed to obey God and kill everybody. My feeling about that, because it's the same type of from man to woman and all of that, my feeling about that is, when we're talking about Amalek and the Amalekites, we're talking about a social phenomenon not unlike Bedouin. And I think that a lot of these encampments weren't necessarily permanent places which had men, women, and children, but were in fact extension outposts of camps of mainly warriors. So I fall back on that. But it is, we aren't told a lot about these places. And clearly the Amalekites continue around, and of course in Esther, Haman is a descendant. So they were never all destroyed. But I would use that and say, otherwise I don't know a whole lot about it because I don't have the information. But that's, I think, what they were. They were a form of Bedouin, which we know existed at that time. We have examples of Bedouin-like groups marching across Sinai, seeking to come into Egypt. Egypt fortified its border. You couldn't get in and out of Egypt easily, and we have records where, like Edomite, the equivalent of Edomite Bedouin, asked to come in because they need water for their flocks. And it's recorded. They're allowed to come in, get water, go out. So all of that is taking place, but yeah, so I think there's something going on there with the Bedouin, which I think maybe is really, a lot of these encampments are warrior-centered in terms of what they're about. Yeah.
I mean, you and Charlie Trim have your own intellectual battle of Jericho going on here.
Yeah.
But as people acknowledge this, and Eleph being translated, differently, and in terms of 1,000, and the word city being seen as fort, and those possibilities, how will this kind of archaeological, anthropological, linguistic work help change translations
Yeah,
of
people
these
ask
texts?
that.
Yeah. Because they're read in this kind of traditional way now, or at least translated that way. How does this kind of work affect future translations?
Yeah. Well, the word for city is a pretty amorphous word, and you still tend to get sometimes you get towns, and I am honored to serve on the translation committee for the NIV. In fact, we met a couple weeks ago. We meet every year for about a week. The NIV has a footnotes on 1,000, and it says, I believe at a couple places, that it can mean something else. If the NIV or any other major translation put, it's 600 squads or something like that, I mean, I would agree, but, that would bring down the wrath of... And why do that? When your concern isn't really exactly how many Israelites you had, and then you have to explain it and everything else. So we do it in the study Bibles and try to explain that. So some things are better left that way, just given the traditions in the English language and the impact of certain changes like that. Yeah. So I can speak to those anyway in terms of...
Interesting dynamic there. Other forces that feed into those decisions.
Yeah, now there may come a time when they would reverse it and put squad or company or something like that in, and then put in the footnote with the translation, but that hasn't happened yet, so rely upon those notes.
Interesting.
Yes, you are. Yes, I think it probably will, but, I don't know how, and what I do know is that, or what I've seen, is that AI, as opposed to I, is dependent on the information it receives. And this is the information we have. So there are other ways maybe of configuring it, but there are limitations on the basis of the evidence. So I don't see dramatic changes in a lot of these areas at this point. Where it goes in the future is very hard to say.
Sally?
Yeah. In fact, I was asking for prayer last night at our church for this, and somebody said, somebody's going to ask you about Gaza, Yeah, and it's, of course, it's a terrible, terrible thing, as is, of course, October 7th, which is the kind of, at least the immediate history of this. And I look back at that, and I see the hostages that are still there. My view of Israel as a state is that Israel has a right to exist. It has a right to exist on the basis of international law, UN pronouncements and whatnot. Is Israel of the modern state of Israel equal to the prophetic state of Israel? No. The prophetic state of Israel is a theocratic state governed by God and those who follow God. And the modern state of Israel is a secular state in the tradition of Western democracies and this sort of thing. So it's not. Could it be that it's on its way to that? Yeah, possibly, but I don't know that for sure. But I would still say that Israel, on the basis of international law and just my understanding of justice, has a right to exist. The inhabitants of Gaza also certainly have a right to exist. Hamas is a different story. Hamas is sworn to the it's sworn to genocide, is the only way I can say that. So if the people in Hamas would change, that's fine. But as an organization, Hamas does not fit in the community of nations or in anything that I would consider just or right. So when I pray for a just settlement to this whole matter and for peace, for the people of Gaza to have peace, for the hostages to be released, and no further killing to go on, and for out of this to come something good. But there are certain ideologies that are in control at this point, which that needs to change, because I don't see how that's humanly, I don't see how it's possible.
Great. Good
So
answer.
those are a few observations on thoughts on that. Yeah.
All right. Can we thank Dr. Hess for his time? Yeah. A deep dive into challenging texts, and hope it's been certainly enlightening for me, Rick, and seeing those texts differently. And so thank you for your attentiveness. Thank you for your teaching. Rather than the second Sunday of August, our next summer seminary will be the third Sunday, August 17th. It will be another esteemed Old Testament professor from Denver Seminary, Dr. Knut Heim. Many of you know and remember. And interestingly, his kind of sweet spot in the Old Testament is wisdom literature, and thought it would be fun for him to come and teach on, of all things, Proverbs. So he will be coming on August 17th, and August 24th we'll have Dr. Joey Dodson, a New Testament professor, really diving into Romans 7 on conquerors rather than captivity, as we find ourselves in that, and he's just come out with a book related to that. So can we thank Dr. Hess again for his teaching with us?
Thank you.
And thank you for your presence and being here and help and support in continuing this great tradition.